press the bell icon on the YouTube app and never miss another update.
Namaste children. In our last class we studied about synapses and different types of synapses and also the layers, protective coverings of brain and spinal cord, that is dura mater, arachnoid mater and pia mater. In this today's class we will discuss about brain. In that brain we will discuss in detail about cerebrum. So brain comes under central nervous system. Central nervous system includes brain and spinal cord. So brain, it is a complex structure in our body which contains nearly 100 billion neurons. It contains 100 billion neurons, and the study about this brain is a challenge for in our biology because it is having that much complex structures in it, and brain is very well developed due to evolution in human being also. As he started thinking and reasoning, that leads to the development of brain. The brain size, the size of the brain, it weighs in adults, it weighs about 1370 to 1480 grams, whereas in children or in newborn it weighs about 370 to 400 grams, and it starts increasing in its size up to age 20 years. Up to age 20 years it increases in its size. It increases in its size up to age 20 years. So in adults it weighs about 1370 to 1480 grams. In newborn it weighs nearly about 370 to 400 gram, and it increases in its size up to age 20 years. So the brain is divided into three parts. It is divided into forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. So the brain is divided into three parts. Yadu forebrain, midbrain and hindbrain. Forebrain is also called prosencephalon. Is also called prosencephalon. Midbrain is called as mesencephalon, and hindbrain is called as rhombencephalon. The forebrain is again divided into two parts: cerebrum and diencephalon. Again the diencephalon is divided into thalamus and hypothalamus. Midbrain is divided into two parts: crura cerebri and corpora quadrigimana. Corpora quadrigimana. Hindbrain is again divided into three parts, that is pons, medulla and cerebellum. So, the brain is divided into three parts: forebrain, midbrain and hindbrain. Forebrain is also called prosencephalon, midbrain is also called mesencephalon, hindbrain is also called rhombencephalon. Forebrain is again divided into two parts, cerebrum and diencephalon. Diencephalon is having two parts, thalamus and hypothalamus. So, midbrain is divided into two parts, crura cerebri and corpora quadrigimana. Hindbrain is divided into three parts, pons, medulla oblongata and cerebellum. Next, we will go with in detail study about these different parts of brain. Before going to that, we will go with structure of brain. So, diagram will come for 5 marks. You have to learn to draw this diagram. This is about structure of brain. Let us label the parts. This part is cerebrum. The elevated part is called gyri, and this one is sulci. The deeper one is called fissure. This one is corpus callosum. Cerebral aqueduct. Thalamus. Hypothalamus. Midbrain. Pons. Medulla. Cerebellum, and this one is, it continues as spinal cord. This is sagittal section of human brain. So when we take sagittal section of human brain, we are able to see these structures. This part is called cerebrum. Cerebrum, thalamus and hypothalamus all together forms forebrain. Forebrain. So cerebrum, thalamus and hypothalamus forms the forebrain, and this part is midbrain, and pons, medulla and cerebrum forms hindbrain. Midbrain and hindbrain forms brain stem. Midbrain and hindbrain forms brain stem. They forms brain stem. So so this diagram is in your textbook. Once again you see in that. So the upper part, this is the cerebrum, where we see infoldings or convolutions. We see infoldings or convolutions mainly to increase the surface area. Below the cerebrum, we see a corpus callosum. It is a white structure. It is corpus callosum, which mainly helps to connect right cerebral hemisphere with the left cerebral hemisphere. Below that we see a region called thalamus. Below the corpus callosum we see a region called thalamus, and below that thalamus we see hypothalamus. So cerebrum, thalamus, hypothalamus forms a forebrain, and in the middle of this we see a midbrain. Below the forebrain and above the hindbrain we see a region called midbrain, and this part is pons, and this is medulla, and this one is cerebellum, all forms hindbrain. Midbrain with hindbrain forms brainstem, and this elevated part or ridges on the surface of cerebrum is called gyri. Each gyri are separated by a depression or foldings called sulci. If the depression is smaller, then it is called sulci. If the depression is more, then it is called fissure. And we see cerebral aqueduct here. So medulla continues as spinal cord. This is the structure of brain. This diagram will come for 5 marks. Now we will discuss in detail about cerebrum. This cerebrum, it is the largest part of the brain, and it is the site which involved in the intellectual processes like reasoning, memory, language and consciousness. So it is mainly evolved due to evolution anta helbodu, because during evolution of human beings, the human beings have started increasing their thinking ability, reasoning ability. Due to this, we can see extensive development of cerebrum. The cerebrum is divided into 2 parts, right cerebral hemisphere and left cerebral hemisphere, like this. So cerebrum is divided into 2 parts. Right cerebral hemisphere and left cerebral hemispheres, like this, and these 2 cerebral hemispheres are divided by a deep median longitudinal fissure. Eradu cerebral hemispheres separate agide by a fissure. That fissure is called median longitudinal fissure. That median longitudinal fissure separates cerebrum into right cerebral hemisphere and left cerebral hemispheres, and these 2 are interlinked. They 2 are connected to each other by a structure called corpus callosum. They are connected with each other by a structure called corpus callosum. The right cerebral hemisphere controls the functions of left side of our body. Hagene left cerebral hemispheres controls the functions of our right organs of our body. So right cerebral hemispheres control left side of our body. Left cerebral hemispheres contain right side of our body, functions of right organs of right side of our body. And this cerebrum, as we know that it shows foldings, that foldings give rise to elevated part called gyri, and each gyri are separated from each other by a fissures and sulci. If the infolding is smaller, then we call it as sulci. If the infolding is bigger, then it is called as fissure. That increases the surface area of cerebrum, and nearly from ear to ear 2 to 4 centimeter we call cerebral cortex. The cerebrum from ear to ear 2 to 4 centimeter is called cerebral cortex, which contain grey matter, So the grey matter contains cytons and their dendrites. So from here 2 to 4 centimeter is called cerebral cortex, which contain grey matter. Grey matter means they contain cell bodies and their dendrites. Below that cerebral cortex we see white matter. Corpus callosum is a white matter, mainly contain myelinated axons. So in your competitive they will ask cerebral cortex contain grey matter, they contain cell bodies and their dendrites, and below to cerebral cortex we see white matter that contain myelinated axons. Corpus callosum contain white matter, that means they contain myelinated axons. And this sulci and fissure divide the cerebrum into 4 lobes. They divide the cerebrum into 4 lobes. They divide the cerebrum into 4 lobes. This one is frontal lobe. This one is parietal lobe. This is occipital lobe. Occipital lobe. This one is temporal lobe. This gyri and sulci of fissures divide the cerebrum into 4 lobes: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe and occipital lobe. Frontal lobe means this part, frontal lobe. Parietal lobe, this kivi pakka idella, that is temporal lobe, and posteriorly that is occipital lobe. Frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe and occipital lobe. Frontal lobe and parietal lobe are separated from each other. They both are separated from each other by a fissure called central fissure or sulcus of Rolando. Frontal lobe and parietal lobe are separated each other by a fissure called central sulcus or sulcus of Rolando. Like that, parietal and temporal are separated by a fissure called lateral fissure or Sylvian fissure. Lateral fissure or Sylvian fissure. And parietal and occipital are separated by a fissure called parieto-occipital fissure or sulcus. Parieto-occipital sulcus. And the frontal lobe we see, in the frontal lobe we see it is a site where the processing of reasoning, problem solving and speech occurs. In the frontal lobe, we see a processing of reasoning, problem solving, speech, thought. All these analysis and processing will be taken place in frontal lobe. And in parietal lobe, we see processing of movement and orientation and reasoning. So, in parietal lobe, we see processing of movement, orientation and reasoning. In occipital lobe, we see visual processing. It is important. In occipital lobe, we see visual processing. In temporal lobe, we see auditory processing. That means hearing. So, this is about different lobes. So, the fissure and sulci divided the cerebrum into 4 lobes: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe and temporal lobe. ನಿಮಗೆ ಕಾಂಪಿಟೇಟಿವ್ ನೆನಪಿಟ್ಕೋಬೇಕಾಗಿರೋದು, the sulcus that divides frontal lobe into parietal lobe is sulcus of Rolando or central sulcus. ಹಾಗೆಯೇ parietal ಮತ್ತು temporal is separated by lateral fissure or sylvian fissure. Like that, parietal and occipital is separated by parieto-occipital sulcus. And temporal is mainly associated with processing of auditory, and occipital is associated with visual processing. In parietal, we see processing of movement, orientation and reasoning, whereas in frontal, we see processing of reasoning, problem solving, thought, speech, etc. So the next we'll go with cerebrum. Cerebrum contains 3 different functional areas. Cerebrum contains 3 different functional areas. It contains 3 functional areas. One is sensory areas, another one is motor areas, another one is association areas. And again, association areas, we have intersensory communication, then memory, then communication. So the cerebrum this part cerebrum contains 3 functional areas. One is sensory area, another one is motor area, other one is association area. Sensory area, so in the sensory area we see sensory impulses are analyzed in the sensory areas like touch, heat, cold, etc. So it's in sensory area, analysis of sensory impulses takes place like touch, heat, cold, etc. Whereas in motor area, there we see generation of motor impulses like Broca's area. Broca's area is responsible for speech. So the impulses generated in Broca's area regulates the movement of tongue and speech. So motor area, they generates motor impulses. Example, Broca's area, the motor impulses which are generated in Broca's area regulates the movement of tongue and speech. Coming to association areas, association and a mix. So here the nerves are not able to differentiate clearly whether they are sensory nerves or motor nerves. Nodi, sensory means they are purely sensory nerves. Motor means they are purely motor in nature. That means they carry information away from the brain. Motor nerves carry information away from the brain. Sensory nerves, they carry information towards the brain. But in association areas, the nerves cannot be differentiated into sensory or motor. That areas are called association areas. That association areas they are doing functions like intersensory communication, memory and communication. Intersensory communication antandre, we see the sensory impulses carrying smell, touch, visual, all the sensory impulses are taken to the brain. Different sensory impulses are taken to the brain, where each are associated and interconnected with each other in order to properly they have to send message to they should interpret properly. So intersensory communication alli enagutte, now ondsali enadru, so we see any eatable things nodid tashna ಬಾಯಲ್ಲಿ ಸಲೈವಾ ಬರ್ತಿರುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಒನ್ಸ್ ವಿ ಟೇಸ್ಟ್ ತಕ್ಷಣ ದ ಸ್ಮೆಲ್ ಈಸ್ ಗುಡ್, ಟೇಸ್ಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಗುಡ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತೀವಿ. ಸೊ ಆಲ್ ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಮೇನ್ಲಿ ಡ್ಯೂ ಟು ಇಂಟರ್ ಸೆನ್ಸರಿ ಕಮ್ಯುನಿಕೇಷನ್. The sensory impulses, different sensory impulses after entering the cerebrum, they associate and interconnect with each other to interpret properly. That is mainly due to intersensory communication. Memory and association areas with other lobes present in the cerebrum record all the memory of past events. Memory means association areas with the other lobes present in the cerebrum records all the memory of past events. There are two types of memory, short-term memory and long-term memory. Communication, association areas are also ability to control. They also have ability to control communication. So these are the functions of cerebrum. So in cerebrum we see three functional areas: sensory areas, motor areas and association areas. Sensory areas where the sensory impulses are analyzed like touch, smell, heat, etc. Motor areas, motor impulses are generated. Example, Broca's area which regulates movement of tongue and speech. Association areas, here the neurons are not able to differentiate into either sensory or motor. They are mixed here. They control the functions like intersensory communication, memory and communication. Intersensory communicationally, all the sensory inputs which enter into the cerebral cortex are associated and interconnect with each other to interpret properly. Memory areas with the other lobes present in the cerebrum, association areas are able to record memory of past events. There are two types of memory, short-term memory and long-term memory, and these association areas are also have ability to control communication. So this is about cerebrum. In our next class, we will discuss about thalamus, hypothalamus of forebrain and the functions of midbrain and hindbrain. Thank you.